She stood barefoot on the packed earth, while a ledger decided her fate. Amina was 22 that night, a thin scratch of moon over the outbuilding roofs. Inside the house, Master Henry and his overseer bent over a book, a scribe's ink still wet on the margin where a name would be altered. Outside, Amina folded a scrap of ruled paper into the hem of her skirt, only a whisper against the dirt. What happened between the pages and the porch that followed would not be recorded as a single dramatic event in any statute. It was folded into columns, footnotes, and a ritual sequence of acts that made intimacy legible as property. In this episode, we examine that sequence, the cluster of administrative and ceremonial moves this film calls, for analytic clarity, the second night. To be clear, that phrase is not an archival catchword found in the records as a formal title. It is an operational label we use to group together a set of practices and entries that recur in the household files. We explain why we use it and what the records themselves show. You will hear fragments of ledgers and petitions. We will reconstruct scenes based on depositions, and experts will speak to provenance and meaning. Full transcriptions and a source list are linked in the video description. If you want more hidden files opened and the full sources as we go, subscribe now and the list will be in the description. The household functioned as an institution. That institution had a spine: bookkeeping, the minister's rhetoric, the overseer's log, and, when needed, the magistrate's signature. Births were columns, infractions were rows, affection, sex, lineage, all passed through the ledger until they appeared as entries, assignments, and subheads, economic categories that could be bought, sold, reassigned, or suppressed. County ledgers show how routine this translation was. In ledger after ledger, clerks recorded births, transfers, and punishments in the same ink. They did not write the full life. They wrote the administrative consequence. A typical entry reads, in shorthand and black script, a list of names followed by a verb of disposition: assigned, transferred, apprenticed. These entries do not narrate cruelty. They register decisions. Excerpt. Paraphrase from County Ledger. Box X, Folio Y, County Archive. A line lists Amina, reassigned to Mistress Evelyn, Domestic Corrective Service. The ledger places the act of renaming and reassigning on the same column as rations, wages owed, and repairs needed in the stable. Excerpt. Letter extract. Minister Jonas Folder, County Archive. A brief note from the minister to the steward cites a consecration performed to settle the matter, and requests a record be made for the church register. The wording reframes an intimate encounter as a moral adjudication requiring documentation. Excerpt. Petition to magistrate, petition book, County Archive. A petition from a household servant pleads for the return of a child misrecorded in the account. The margins annotated by an inspector with an arrow and the word investigate. These excerpts do not by themselves name a ritual. They do, however, corroborate that household actors used parish and household instruments, registers, ministerial notes, ledger lines, to convert intimate incidents into administrative facts. Amina grew into this system slowly. She was not born to it, and then simply absorbed. Circumstances pushed her toward it. She lost her father when she was a child. Debts accumulated on a tiny farm nearby. Schooling was a handful of winter lessons with the parish catechist. Her mother stitched shirts by lamplight and taught her the names of plants. Amina learned letters the way some people learn to listen. Careful, attentive, knowing that a line could save or condemn. When Master Henry took in Amina's household, it was as much economic restructuring as it was social. Households like his were not simple private families. They were enterprises. The steward tracked labor with columns that resembled a merchant's ledger. The overseer managed bodies on the same spreadsheet that accounted for plow repairs and candle wax. The minister was paid to make moral sense of whatever disorder arrived at the door. The scribe Thomas wrote what those men wanted to make official. Reconstruction, from depositions, County Archive. Amina standing with her sleeve damp from the washing, watching Caleb the overseer call the steward. Scribe Thomas brings the book. The steward's pen hovers over her name. Master Henry says, in a voice later repeated in several depositions, "We must settle the house before the winter markets. The parish will bless it, and the ledger will confirm it." Thomas marks a line. That line carries consequences. It assigns labor, determines ration shares, and establishes which children belong in which column. For the person whose name is written, it can mean the loss of prior kinship rights, visits curtailed, letters inspected, the simple right to sleep in a mother's bed put under license. The discovery that precipitated the tribunal in Amina's case began with a note, small, brittle, found tucked into a sleeve. The note was, read by different witnesses, both banal and incendiary. A few words of affection between Amina and Daniel, a field hand. A neighbor found the paper and reported it to Rosa, the cook, who brought it to Mistress Evelyn. The discovery became a process in which private language transformed into public accusation. Reconstruction. From depositions, County Archive. The kitchen kettle hissed. Rosa held the folded paper with 2 scarves around her wrist. She handed it to Mistress Evelyn, who, in a low voice, called for Pastor Jonas. "It is for the good of the house," Mistress Evelyn is reported to have said. It cannot stand. The tribunal was not a courtroom in the modern sense, but it followed a procedural logic. The household convened in the parlor, Master Henry presiding, Pastor Jonas enlisted as moral arbiter, Caleb as factual witness, Thomas as recorder. The design was to transform a private transgression into an administrable fact. What the tribunal could not do by law, it could do through ritual and paperwork. Reconstruction. From depositions and a steward's memo, County Archive. Pastor Jonas reads from a small book, his phrases steeped in the same diction he uses in baptisms. "We call this a consecration," he says, "that the community may not be scandalized." The scribe writes the term in the margin, consecration, and later the steward enters a ledger note, regularized under household contract. This sequence of reading, naming, and writing produced the second operation, the initial moral censure, and then the administrative consolidation. Hence the phrase we use for this pattern. Second night, the moment when a private transgression is converted into a marketable, administrable status. Again, the phrase is analytic, not a citation from the archive. The records show repeated acts of renaming, reading, and ledger alteration. They do not provide a neat, single term across documents. We borrow a phrase to make visible the pattern. Trigger warning. The next section discusses coercive control and forced regularization. We will describe institutional processes and consequences. We will avoid graphic detail and focus on administrative coercion and structural violence. The ritual itself combines sensory acts and administrative outcomes. Witnesses describe baths, less a hygienic cleansing than a symbolic undoing, haircut short, a new name spoken in an official tone, a token or note recorded. These acts were often described in the minister's notes as penitential or consecratory. To the woman subjected to them, they had immediate embodied effects: altered clothing, changed sleeping arrangements, new labor tasks, fewer visitors. To the household administration, they were a change in the ledger, a new line, a cross-reference, a change in ration allotment. Excerpt. Minister Jonas Folder, County Archive, paraphrase. After consecration, the woman shall be considered under the household's custody. Records to be updated accordingly. The minister's language shifts the encounter from moral failing to one requiring administrative action. A detailed illustrative passage in the steward's log shows how naming produced new rights and new losses. A small entry recorded not just reassigned, but reassigned for correction and domestic reassignment. Rations were recalculated, children's entries moved to different columns, and visitation requests put under subject to steward's permission. Reconstruction, scribe's marginalia, and steward's note, County Archive. Thomas writes in the margin of a ledger, upon consecration, reduce rations by half until regularization completed. The steward annotates that the woman in question must be placed under corrective domestic oversight, and that the index sheet be updated. These administrative moves were never neutral. They were instruments of control that reoriented kinship and labor. A child, once claimed in one account, could be moved in another. A name, once scratched, could vanish into an index and be replaced by a household number. The ledger, with its columns and abbreviations, is where the household turned intimacy into ledger figures. Expert commentary. Dr. Lewis, an archivist who has worked extensively with household papers in this region, notes, what looks like clerical economy is also a technique of governance. These books are methods for producing legible human assets. The hard part is reading for the erasures and marginalia that betray resistance. Resistance was constant and small. People hid letters in hems, stitched names into cuffs, and wrote alternate records on scraps. Amina sewed Daniel's initial into the cuff of her apron, a discreet sign that did not show on the official roll call. Others tucked notes inside bread loaves or left marks in the plaster that only certain children would know to read. These acts of clandestine remembrance were the archive's counter-archive, things left deliberately off the books. Reconstruction. Hidden letter found sewn into apron, county archive. A tiny note reads, in a hand that may be Amina's, "Meet at dusk by the sycamore. If not, wait." The note's survival suggests someone wanted to resist the ledger's authority. When resistance showed its face more formally, it often took the shape of petitions. An entry in the petitions book recounts a plea from a woman seeking the return of her child to her care. The petitions were routed through inspectors and the magistrate's office. They rarely reversed household decisions, but they did create documentary pressure. Excerpt, petition to magistrate, petition book, county archive, paraphrase. A servant petitions for recognition of maternal rights over child listed in household account, requests inspection and review of ledger entry. The inspector's reply is often dry, an order to investigate, or a note that the household's ledger is to be presented. Investigation rarely meant an overturning of authority. More often it meant a further layer of paperwork, inspections, affidavits, and new marginalia that attempted to rationalize previous entries. The household's record-keeping habit proved resilient. It had both short-term force and long-term erasure. Erasure took many forms. Pages were trimmed, ink was washed out by accidents and by design. Some entries were overwritten, older lines drowned in fresh script. In a handful of cases, pages were physically removed, leaving private hands to speculate about what had been lost. But erasure is never complete. Traces remain in water stains, in palimpsest, ghosts of earlier writing visible to the patient eye. Expert commentary. Professor Andrews, a historian of household law, explains, "Archives are palimpsests." Officials understood that the power of a book lay not only in what it recorded, but in what it could hide. Erasure was part of the administrative toolkit, an attempt to smooth over irregularities that might later be costly. In one cluster of documents that we have given particular attention, a petition, a set of hidden letters, and a ledger page with a rubbed margin together suggest a pattern of ritualized coercion and administrative regularization. Excerpt, cluster, county archive, paraphrase. Petition. Requesting review of household record concerning child assigned to household. Hidden letters, scraps referencing a consecration and a place where they shaved my hair. Ledger page, an entry where the woman's name is moved to a new column with the annotation corrective assignment. The margin faintly shows an earlier name scraped out. When laid side by side, these pieces do not provide a single courtroom-style proof. They do, however, corroborate one another. A disappearance on the ledger, a pile of letters testifying to a different private life, and a petition that seeks to reopen the administrative decision. Reconstruction. Tribunal scene reconstructed from depositions and steward's pocket memorandum, county archive. The parlor was cold. Pastor Jonas recited phrases meant to frame the act as a moral remedy. Master Henry signed a paper. Scribe Thomas recorded a new ledger line. Amina was asked to repeat words she did not choose. The household cataloged the event as a correction. The act closed with a token, an updated household index number assigned, and an instruction to the overseer: observe and report. The consequences of this administrative ritual extended to children and to genealogies. For generations, family trees could be rearranged by a single annotation. Descendants searching for ancestors would find their names mismatched or absent, their lineages split across parish and household registers that did not speak with one another. A child assigned to a household column could be listed later in a parish register under an altered surname. A mother listed in the steward's book might not be recognized in the baptismal roll. We do not invent outcomes, but we can show how records create obstacles for descendants. Consider a composite illustrative case, drawn from multiple records and labeled clearly as an example, rather than a documented single family. Illustration. Composite example. A mother's name appears in a household ledger as reassigned, while in the parish baptismal register, the child's surname corresponds to the household head. Decades later, a descendant finds a marriage certificate using a different surname and wonders if a line was severed. The ledger helped make separation administratively durable. That administrative durability was intentional. Regularization agreements, documents that look like contracts, sometimes drafted by local contractors or intermediaries, function to bind children and women into household structures with defined obligations. In some files, contractors such as Julian appear as signatories to agreements that read like labor contracts. They record who will care for a child and under what terms. These agreements give a marked clarity to human relations. Excerpt: contract-like agreement, county archive, paraphrase. Agreement acknowledging the household charge of child X, terms of care and maintenance to be recorded in the household ledger. The names and signatures on these documents do not mean legal consent in the modern understanding. Rather, they show how private arrangements were formalized to fit economic needs. Daily enforcement followed. The overseer checked cupboards, counted rations, and maintained a discipline of attention. Mistress Evelyn delivered morning lectures on duty. Notes from the steward recorded infractions in the same formal register as debts owed for tools. The sensory experience of enforcement appears across sources. The sound of a bell summoning a servant, the smell of starch in starched shirts, the feel of a shaved neck under colder blankets. These details appear not in a single document, but woven through depositions, marginalia, and personal letters. Reconstruction, domestic day scene, depositions and stewards' lists, county archive. Dawn. Amina rises before light to prepare the children's porridge. Caleb inspects the line of laundry, fingers the cuff where a name is stitched, and frowns. The steward reads a new entry aloud. Infraction, unauthorized meeting with laborer, reduced ration. The morning becomes an audit. Surviving traces of resistance are not only sentimental, they altered the record. Inspectors sometimes noted anomalies. A ledger page, damaged and partially illegible, or margins trimmed. An inspector, Dr. Lewis in the files, wrote comments in a hand different from the steward's. An external attention that places the household under scrutiny. Those external notes are often small windows, a line that reads, evidence of tampering, or hidden letter found within garment. Such marginalia are the archive's fingerprints of contestation. Expert commentary. Amelia, a local historian who first brought these clustered documents to attention, says, "We are looking at households as administrative nodes. When an inspector writes tampered, they give us permission to look closer. The tamperer is not always the household alone. Sometimes it is a church clerk trying to smooth local embarrassments." The cluster we discovered, petition, hidden letters, and an altered ledger page, became a kind of Rosetta Stone for the case. Alone, each item is suggestive. Together, they triangulate. The note implies an effective relationship. The petition registers a claim. The ledger page records administrative correction. Read together, they indicate a pattern, private intimacy being domesticated by paperwork. But a word on limits. The records rarely state motive in legal terms. The steward's log records a decision, not the emotional life behind it. The minister's note reframes things morally. The petition asserts a grievance. Our task is to interpret these documents carefully, to suggest rather than claim, to corroborate rather than conclusively prove. Language matters. The records indicate, suggest, and corroborate. They do not always provide courtroom certainties. The human cost is nonetheless visible. Amina lost autonomy over movement and correspondence. Daniel was reassigned to fieldwork, moved from the ledger as a separate name to an entry under labor unit. Their child, if born, would likely have been recorded under the household's index, complicating later claims. The ledger reconfigured kinship into economic categories. Resistance continued in small acts. A stitched cuff with initials survived and was photographed in the archive. It was dirty and folded, the threads frayed, but the letters remained legible. A.D., perhaps Amina's initials, an act of memory sewn into clothing that the ledger could not fully catalogue. We cannot overstate the difficulty of reconstructing lives from pen strokes, yet the archive offers methods. Palimpsest analysis reveals ghostwriting beneath overwritten lines. Forensic reading, light angled across a page, digital enhancement, makes visible erased words. The archivist's patience, the historian's triangulation, the descendant's memory. These combine to restore names. Expert commentary. Dr. Lewis explains the technical approach. We use raking light and imaging to bring up faded ink. A clerk's erasure becomes visible as a bruise on the paper. That bruise tells us someone tried to remove a line, and often we can read what the line once said. The institutional complicity is clear in the actors named on the pages. Ministers who offered prayers also wrote admonitions. Scribes who were expected to be neutral often embraced the household's administrative logic. Overseers who enforced discipline wrote daily notes that later helped to reconstruct the enforcement apparatus. Magistrates who received petitions rarely overruled household decisions, but their offices produced the records that later allowed historians to piece together the story. When descendants search these files, they often confront a bifurcated textual world. parish registers that speak in sacramental language, and household ledgers that speak in economic language. Neither is pure. The parish book may show the child's baptism with the household head's surname. The household ledger may omit the mother's name entirely. The result is genealogical erasure, the architecture of forgetting made durable by administration. Illustration, descendants discovery, composite. A woman in the present day finds a baptismal entry for an ancestor listed under another surname. She also finds a steward's ledger that lists the ancestor's mother under a different index. The mismatch raises questions about whether the family's line had been administratively reassigned generations earlier. These are the puzzle's record-keeping leaves for those who follow. The final urgent lesson is both archival and moral. Archives are sites of loss and recovery. They were instruments of erasure in the household's hands and instruments of recovery in the hands of investigators. Recognizing their double role means insisting on better preservation and on making sources accessible to descendants. We must also be careful with labels. Calling the sequence of acts the second night helps us to talk about them collectively, but the label must not obscure the complexity. The records themselves show a mosaic. One household steward classifying a woman as corrected, another minister noting a consecration, a ledger page rubbed and faint. We group these acts under a single analytic header to study pattern and mechanism, but always with the caveat that the records themselves employ many terms. There are other clusters across the region with similar patterns. In one adjoining county, a different steward annotates a woman's file with placed under vicar's oversight. In another, a ledger records a child entered under household account. These recurrences suggest administrative techniques rather than isolated violence. They are methods for turning a private event into a household asset. The archivist's rescue work is painstaking. It requires patient imaging, careful transcription, and the willingness to follow marginal notes. In one notable recovery, a page thought to be blank yielded, under ultraviolet light, the faint trace of a name and a sentence. Do not forget. That faint sentence is how the protected memory returns to us. We conclude with the long-term consequences. Names matter, records matter. The ledger's authority reverberates across generations. A stitched cuff, a hidden letter, a petition, these are the tangible traces that resist administrative erasure. They are also the proof that people resisted. If you've been following this narrative, you've seen how household administration, parish rhetoric, and market logic join to transform intimacy into assignable property. You've seen Amina's life refracted through ledger lines, ministerial notes, and petitions. You've seen the forms of resistance and the traces of erasure. You've also seen why we use the phrase second night as an interpretive label, not because the documents called it that, but because that label draws attention to the recurring set of acts, naming, consecrating, recording, that together regularized coerced intimacies in administrative form. This matters today because descendants still search for names and because archives still hold hidden pages. The work of recovering these traces is both scholarly and civic. It is scholarly because it requires careful methodological work, triangulation, imaging, corroboration. It is civic because it impinges on living genealogies and on how communities remember those who were subjected to institutional control. There are practical steps you can take. Support local archives that preserve fragile ledgers. Advocate for digitization projects that make marginalia visible to researchers and descendants. Share transcriptions responsibly. In the description below this video, we have linked the transcriptions used in this episode along with repository references. If you are a descendant seeking guidance, consult archivists before handling fragile materials. They can direct you to ethical practices. Final note, the stitched cuff remains our emblem. It is small, worn, and intimate. It resists the ledger's flat logic by being tactile memory. It says, quietly and stubbornly, that names and relationships were retained in practice even when they were denied on paper. If this story moved you, share it with someone who cares about history and justice. Support the archives listed in the description. Help keep the names remembered.